And the last layer to that is instead of attaching to the result that I want to make someone my mentor, it's attaching to the idea that if I show up to every conversation authentically, vulnerably, and truly aligned to who I am and who I want to be, the right mentor is going to fall in my lap if I have enough conversations. And I think that's the key. It's changing how you operate when you enter that conversation.
Welcome back to episode 3, getting to Yes with N.O.P.E podcast. I'm your host, David Floor. We have an exciting episode this time around. And as mentioned in our previous podcast, the purpose of this is to hear stories from professionals as they share their experience breaking through to different industries or getting through the networking, creating opportunities for themselves, being prepared for those moments and excelling. So at every point of someone's lives, they have this breakthrough moment where they're at this glass ceiling and they need to get through, and not realizing that they have the network in front of them to create those opportunities. And sometimes those opportunities may not fold into something else, but when you're prepared for those moments, you will excel. So over time, we will have different conversations with individuals as they share their stories. And this is the opportunity for you to hear and take away some key nuggets that may resonate with you and apply it to your skill set. So without further ado, I'd love to bring in our next guest in episode 3, Billy Murphy. Him and I had the opportunity to work with each other at Salesforce during our time. I think it was around 2015 to 2018, but it's his time to share his story. And this one's an interesting topic because this is around sobriety and mentorship. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome in Billy. And, why don't you share where you're currently located? And let's start off with your background before we transition into how we got to Yes with N.O.P.E.
Excited to be here. Thanks for bringing me on, David. Ever since, speaking of mentors, ever since I stepped in to Salesforce as an intern, you always took me under your wing. And I, in more ways than you probably even realize right now, looked up to you a ton at Salesforce. So I'm excited to hopefully share a little bit about my story and give back here as well. You've just always been such a good person for me. Specifically, your energy has always just kind of kept me going. So fired up to be here. A little bit of background on me. I currently live in Manhattan Beach, California. I, started with you or met you back in San Francisco at Salesforce. But, today living with my fiance, Megan, in Manhattan Beach, California, and doing software sales, working for a different company called N.O.P.E. We help organizations basically monitor threats that could be impacting their people and locations, and also help them send out notifications during those threats. So think about, there could be a weather event. How do you communicate effectively with those employees? We're kind of helping that whole process out. And it's actually interesting how I got to Alert Media, and maybe that would be a good part of this conversation as well as we progress. But really just about me, living in Manhattan Beach. I mean, I could go into a little bit more about my personal background, but
yeah, sure.
Let's kind of transition.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity, right? Not everybody has the opportunity to break into tech, right? Not everybody has the opportunity to get to Salesforce.
Yep.
So I guess we could start. Not everyone can see how tall you are in this room.
Yeah.
But for people listening in, I walk around about a towering 5'9", and when I met Billy, he basically doubled that. So, where are you originally from?
Yeah.
And how did you get to Salesforce to where we are going to now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from the East Coast. I'm from Greenwich, Connecticut. One of three boys. Was raised, in a single family home. Great mom and dad. Had a great upbringing. As you can imagine, I was always, you kind of alluded to this, I was always tall, which went hand in hand with being an athlete. And really, I look at my first career in life, that was really being an athlete. And I learned a ton through that process. And it translates to sales big time. But I went to Lafayette College. I was a Division I walk-on. Ended up getting to play in March Madness in 2015. Was an incredible experience. Learned from a ton of good teammates. Learned a lot about myself. Learned a lot about what it means to be a competitor. And ultimately, when I was transitioning from my basketball career to my now tech career, I remember I was a junior in college, and I kind of had this realization, like, man, I only have one more year left of basketball. Like, then what? What kind of happens from here? And in college, I was a finance economics major. I was kind of following the path of my dad, my grandparents, everyone in my family was always in finance. I had done a few internships in finance. I thought it was going to be where I was going to land, and ultimately, um, I just couldn't get behind it. I did some internships. I didn't want to crunch numbers for the rest of my life. I didn't want to sit, behind a computer screen. I felt like if I were to get into sales in that area, it wasn't aligned. So I actually got connected with one of my mom's best friend's brothers, who is a mentor of mine in the software space, and he basically shared his story about how he was in the exact same shoes as me. He was coming out of college, thought he was going to get into finance, had no idea why, just kind of always had that in his mind, and then ultimately got introduced to software. Went to San Francisco back in the 90s, 80s. I don't even know. He's a little bit older than me, but kind of rode the Silicon Valley train. Um, you know, Worked at Oracle and just basically got a really good mentor in him. And he sold me on software sales. So I basically just took a leap of faith. Honestly, I knew finance wasn't it. I didn't really know what else was for me. And based on what I learned about software sales and how athletics translates to that role, I thought it was a great fit. And ultimately applied for Salesforce and a few other companies right out of college. I remember I got the gig and moved across the country from Connecticut, having never been to San Francisco before, and just got that's just kind of how I am. I don't know. I just kind of, once I commit to something, I'm all in, and I'll share a little bit more about that from the sobriety lens. But similar to my software career, it felt right, it felt aligned, and leaned in, and it was the best decision I ever made.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, right? So there's a lot of listeners here. There's a lot of people that struggle with that, thinking that they're going to college for one thing, and then they walk away going into a career field that is not what they went to college for. I majored in criminal justice. I wanted to be a juvenile probation officer, and I stumbled into tech. And for you, you had that great network, and you were basically exposed to, hey, this is the earning potential you can have. Now, granted, in the 90s and in the 80s, we're talking about silicon wafers and semiconductors versus SaaS software and API management and things of that nature and connecting systems together. But for people listening on the phone, that was just a nope, getting to yes with nope opportunity right there. And I'm not sure if you basically struck gold just out of the blue applying at Salesforce, but I'm sure you probably fell on your face a couple times interviewing at other companies. And that may not always be the case for others. But before we go a little bit into the sobriety, do you want to like kind of highlight what that journey was like getting into tech and those conversations? And
Yeah.
because there's people in finance that may not want to do that 9 to 5 anymore, or are graduating college thinking about what should I do after. So maybe if you can just leave a little couple nuggets there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me was this was completely uncharted territory. So I think coming out of, college, you're kind of approaching the world and you have no idea. You try to do your best, but you don't really know what's out there.
Yeah.
And I remember, my dad gave me this advice. He was like, just have these informational interviews. He was like, call as many people as you can and ask them about their career. And then once you kind of have that conversation, which is what happened with this tech scenario, and it feels right, lean into that and ask more questions. So ultimately, I leaned into my mentor now and asked him, what was his perspective on the industry? Where did he think the best companies were? If you were coming out of college and you were in my shoes, what organizations would you apply to and why? And ultimately, through our conversations, I quickly understood I wanted to go to the place that was going to set me up for success over the course of not only my immediate next 5 years, but the next 15, 20, 30 years, assuming I stay in this software world. So when I think about what I was thinking through in terms of the attributes of the things I was looking for in a company, I wanted to have a great training program. I wanted to be an established name that I could have on my resume that everyone would know, hey, he worked at this company. There's some credibility there. And then the third thing that I was looking for was I wanted a career path. I wanted a clear career path that I could follow. And I knew that if I set specific goals and I succeeded, there would be a next job waiting for me. And when I was looking through the market, Salesforce was at the top of the list, and I applied there, and I ultimately landed an internship out of college there. Took a chance. It was like a contracted job. I felt like that company, was the best formula based on those criteria: training, career path, and the ability to just kind of learn. Right. I think I was in the learning phase. So landed that job, got in, and kind of rose the ranks there. And candidly, I got there through my network. I think when you think about N.O.P.E, when you're coming into a scenario that is uncharted territory, I think the first place to always start is figure out other people that you know or that are like you that have done something similar, and then ask them about that path and get their advice. And then the puzzle pieces kind of fall in pretty well from there.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of nuggets that you just disclosed during that talk track. Uh, During our time at Salesforce, everybody talked around build your brand
Yep.
and have coffee meetings, but every meeting is practically an interview. So you have to leave with a good footprint, make a good impression, especially if you're talking to an executive or a leader of that nature. And you and I can contest of how much we created a network during our time at Salesforce. And a lot of times people that I've talked to that worked with us at Salesforce were just scared to reach out to these leaders and scared to ask the
Yeah.
questions. And they didn't just, they were trying to figure it out too at some point in their lives. So if you're not asking for a direct job, someone's always willing to share their story because people love to talk. People love to share their story and share their insights and give advice when they can. So I think that was very beneficial, and it was great for you to share that. For people who are listening on the phone that, hey, finance isn't working for me. How do I want to break into, or maybe I'm working in, a blue collar job and I want to break into the white collar industry. But there are some good and bads, right? Salesforce created this window for you, but then it also created another window. And I'd love for you to share your story about that, because
Yeah.
there's people who may be suffering with that today.
Yeah, and I think if you're open to it, I'd love to double click on what you said about the networking piece, because I do think you highlighted a really important piece, which is a lot of people ask the question, like, how do I network? How does that actually work? What are the right questions to ask when I have that conversation? And I think what's always guided me personally is, and you hear this all the time, but it's true, is curiosity. And I think it's also like networking is your first test to show someone that you're capable of doing the job that you're seeking. So if you're coming from a blue collar job, find someone else like you that's come from a blue collar job and gotten into the industry that you're looking to get into, and ask them a ton of questions about that.
I
Because at the
love
end of
that.
the day, people love to talk about themselves, and people will want to mentor you if you ask them questions about themselves and they walk away from that conversation feeling as though you created almost this like new opportunity for them to help someone that was like them. And the
Absolutely.
best way to do that is be curious about their own career path. So my advice whenever anyone asks, like, how do I network? How do I do that? It's be curious, but it's do your homework up front to understand the path that the individual in which you're going to be reaching out to has had, and cater the conversation to them.
Yep.
Be strategic in the sense that ask them questions that's going to yield the answers you want, but make those questions directed to who that individual is. And then from there, it will naturally progress. And a lot of the time, you'll see that individual is going to be asking you questions as well. So you can start kind of having that organic conversation. But I think
Absolutely.
that's such an important thing.
Yeah. And I think one thing goes unnoticed where people will reach out expecting a handout and expecting, hey, because I know Billy, he's going to give me a job at Salesforce. Doesn't work that way. And I think that's where having the network and creating opportunities doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the first opportunity and strike gold. You're going to fall on your face. And the more you're prepared for those moments and you're asking the right questions and understanding what it takes, that's when you excel. And I think for you, you've already created that path. And but now we're obviously talking around another area where you were in a rut and you needed
Yep.
to continue to create another network to open yourself up and get back to level playing field. So I'd love for you to share your story about that.
Yeah. So, it's funny. I give this advice on networking, and the reality is when I was 22, 23, coming out of college, I was an athlete, and basketball was something that was my life. But what I didn't realize was the underlying framework that I operated from was very much always looking for external validation. I was only as good as the number on the stat sheet. I was only as good as what my coach thought of me in practice that day. I was only as good as the grade I got in that exam. I was only as good as what other people were saying. And although I was like a high achiever and I had this big vision and a great mentor and I created this path for me at Salesforce, that underlying framework was not sturdy. Candidly, I lacked a lot of, self-love and ability to self-motivate on my terms. Everything that I did early on in my career was about the dashboard. It was about how do I make other people think I'm the right fit for them? How do I make sure that, everyone else knows who Billy is, that he's the big, energetic, fun guy that's going to work hard and show up? And ultimately, what that led to me was, hitting the happy hours, going to every event possible, because I thought if I show up to all these things, everyone's going to like me. I'm going to create a network and it's going to be great. What I didn't think about was drinking Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, roll into the weekend. It just becomes this horrible habit.
Yeah.
And ultimately, in my family, addiction's been something that is, is real in our world and something I was always aware of, but I never thought it could be me. And the next thing you knew, I was drinking Tuesdays, Thursdays, Wednesdays. Then the next thing you know, it's like I couldn't say no to the opportunity to have fun with other people.
Yeah.
And it just spiraled out of control. And when I look back at myself, it was because I was operating from the lens of wanting to impress other people, wanting to prove to other people that I belonged. And I don't know, you know, what happened, but I actually had a conversation when I was a BDR at Salesforce with a mentor of mine. He was an account executive at Salesforce at the time. And he had shared something, I see so much potential in you. I think you're going to be an incredible salesman. I think that you have so much ahead of you in your career. Um, and my reaction that night was, candidly, I'm the man. This is awesome. I'm going to go crush my career. I ended up going out, partying, doing the thing, a lot of salespeople can fall into. And I woke up the next day super hungover. And I had this aha moment where I was like, if I keep going down this path of chasing what other people think of me, putting my worth based on other people's affirmations, and just chase this like external validation constantly, that potential that person's going to talk about will never actually happen. So I had this weird like aha moment where I realized, I can't keep drinking like this. I can't keep, running my career based on numbers. I can't keep running everything I do in my life based on the validations of others. And I need to change something. And like literally that day, everything changed. In August of 2018, I ultimately made the decision to be sober. And it wasn't just the decision to be sober, though. It was the decision to commit to myself that I was going to start living life on the terms that make me internally fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it sounds a lot more simple than the road was. It was very difficult. But I did notice that the second that I made that switch, that one decision changed everything in my career. It changed everything in the way that I thought about things. And I'm happy to get into that more. But I think for me, it's like whenever someone asks me like, why did you make that change or what did that change do? It's simply, am I validating and creating fulfillment in my life based on things outside of me? to changing it to creating things that make me happy as an individual and applying those values to everything I do in life. And that kind of just skyrocketed my career and took me to a whole different stratosphere.
That is very interesting. Obviously, we were working together when you decided to become sober. We never really dove deep into that, right? Into those conversations. And growing up myself, I actually didn't drink and I didn't smoke. And then as I got older in my 20s, those happy hours started coming up and you start doing the drinking. But there was something that you said that was really interesting around validation from others. And there's social media is the
Yeah.
biggest double-edged sword for that. How many people want that validation? And even though you're talking about sobriety, how many people are stuck wanting that, chasing those likes on social media? And I think
Yep.
this can also apply to that as well too in your story. So and you had that aha moment, but what was the step after that? Who did you reach out to that created that N.O.P.E opportunity?
Yeah, man. I have a mentor that is a life friend now. Um, Basically the path was I realized I had a problem. It wasn't just seeking validation, but it was like every time I drank, it turned into bad things. So the stem of that was seeking validation, but the reality is I had a drinking problem and I had to deal with it. And I remember calling my family, letting them know. And ultimately, one of my best friends, who's actually one of my basketball teammates, got me connected with someone in his world that I had met a few times that has now become like one of my best friends and a huge mentor
Mm-hmm.
in terms of helping me get down the path of sobriety. Right. And it's interesting you bring this up because there's always this common thread in my life where the second that I realize, hey, there's something I want or there's something I need and I don't know how to do it, how can I find someone else to help me go walk that path? How can I find someone else that's walked in this, the path in which I want to walk? And how can I learn about it? And how can I commit fully to that? And every time I've made that decision of, hey, I don't know, I'm going to surrender to this. I don't know what this looks like. I just know I need to do it. And then I find that mentor or I become, attached to someone that's done this before. Usually the right things fall into place. But it's having this isn't me saying like I'm doing this right. It's more just personally what has always happened for me. It's when I realize that there needs to be a change in my life or I'm looking for something and I just put my ego away and I surrender the fact that I don't know anything here. So I'm going to go find someone that does. By having a ton of conversations from that lens, you're going to find the right mentor to pull you along. Because the right person, I believe at least, will show up in your life as long as you're being authentic and really honest about what you don't know and what you're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. And I think these are great messages, and this is a great story, right? Because this doesn't even have to apply to what you went through. And I couldn't tell you how many stories I've had with friends that were stuck in moments like that. And I think everyone has a story that they can share that they've either had personally or witnessed that went through something like that. And either it continues to spiral down or they break out and they have stories like yours. Um, and I think for me is what were some of the obstacles that you face, right? You said
Yeah.
August 2018. So it's been 4 years and congratulations to that.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
what were some of the obstacles that you faced and how did you continue to overcome them during this 4 year run and continue to keep moving on?
Yeah, man. I think this traces back to like me being a kid, right? Like, and I'm saying this in the sense of like, I think the metaphor for me is always like the man in the mirror. And I think that like for me, when I look in the mirror now, I listen to myself. I don't avoid the things that I know need to be taken care of. Um, I actually look them head on and address them for what they were. And I think in my sobriety journey, I think the biggest obstacle for me is I wasn't willing to look in the mirror at myself. I was always looking at what other people thought. Well, what did Billy think? What did Billy want to accomplish? What are the things that Billy feels as though he needs to adjust?
Mhm.
And it sounds so simple, but like your gut and your wiring and who you are is ingrained deep within you. And when you're willing to just look in that mirror every day and be vulnerable and honest and authentic and just listen to like, hey, you know what? I'm off track here. That's okay. Let's readjust. Let's get through it. Versus, hey, I'm off track here. Oh, I'm going to go find someone else to prove to me that I'm actually not off track so I can justify that I'm off track.
Yeah.
And I've created this cadence internally where if I look in the mirror and I reflect and I say, hey, these are the 5 areas of my life that I'm struggling in right now. And there's still a bunch of things, right? I'm not this, life is a up and down
Yep.
thing. But it's the framework. It's the, where am I at? What are the things that matter to me? What's my plan to accomplish them? How am I going to hold myself accountable? Do that for a month, lift my head up, go back, do it again and again. So the obstacle for me has always been, am I really acting with integrity to myself? And am I being honest with others? And it sounds like the simplest benchmark, but it's just for me, it's so real. It's, am I being honest with myself and am I being honest with others? And you know the answer to that within half a second.
Absolutely.
And if you can answer you're being honest every time, maybe I'm biased. I'm confident that the right things will start falling into place.
I think a lot of this, at some point, I want to focus on an episode around just mental health. And a
Yep.
lot of this has to do with mental health. And I know that people would like to brush things under the rug and not talk about it, right? And they know the answers as well too. Was there, as you're going through the sobriety, how much of mental health elements came into this to where you needed to continue to keep reaching out and talk about it as well too? And what were some of the
Yeah, man.
things that you added to that sobriety journey when you first started?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think you nailed it. It's all mental health. Um, you know, for me, and I think with a lot of mental health situations, it comes back to the ego, and it's not anything other than like, are we willing to admit to other people that like we're struggling? And instead of being ashamed and admitting and finding the people you love and you trust in your circle and avoiding that, and partially admitting that to yourself, which is arguably the hardest part,
Yep.
like knowing there's a whole entire world out there that's going to accept you with open arms. And once you can be that authentic version of yourself and admit like, hey, I'm really going through it here. I need some help. I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah.
Or, hey, I'm making some bad decisions. I think, maybe I have a problem. Like admitting that to yourself, right? Just having that vulnerable, like put your hands and knees on the ground and say like, I have no control over this and it's okay. And really get vulnerable and authentic around that with yourself and others. Um, I think that's like the first step to being able to kind of rechange what's happening in your life. I have this metaphor, and it's nothing. I always, I always think about it. It's like, I think my mind is like the GPS in your car, right? Your brain and the way you think and the way you talk to yourself, your thoughts are ultimately going to be the coordinates in which you live your life towards. So like if your thoughts is the GPS, your feelings are the fuel to the car, right? The way you think ultimately dictates the emotions that you're experiencing, and those emotions create energy, and then those emotions go into the actions, right? So that's actually how you're going to get from point A to point B. If you're not being honest about what your coordinates are right now,
Yeah.
it's going to keep bringing you back there. So the only way to change the outcome of your life and where you're headed is to change the coordinates. And that starts with vulnerability, authenticity, integrity, and really being able to look at that man in the mirror and be like, hey, this is where I'm at. It's okay. I'm going to admit this to myself first and then try to find other people that can support me in this. I mean, that change alone, man, just changed everything in my world. I had too much pride in the past to admit I was never that guy. I was the high achieving athlete that always did well. And it was like, no, that was the number one thing that held me back. And the second that I was willing to say, you know what, I'm not perfect. There's a lot of things I need to work on. And I'm going to just admit it and lean in and see what happens. It's insane how fast life starts rolling in the right direction.
What's
So,
interesting about that point as well too. A lot of people don't want to admit that they have issues, or I couldn't tell you how many friends I grew up with that I recently started just opening up and saying, "Hey, I'm struggling here, I'm struggling there," and them admitting back to you that they're struggling with the same issues.
Yeah.
And the relationship that I've had just has even become stronger with some of those friends. Friends that went into the military, that got out, that were struggling with PTSD, friends that were in bad relationships or in relationships that were either bringing them nowhere and they were just kind of too afraid to talk about it. But the more I started opening up and sharing them kind of my struggles, because everyone goes through struggles, right?
Yeah, man.
And the more you started going through it and the more you started opening up and sharing it, how many people started reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, Billy, I'm stuck. Like, how do I get to yes with no?"
Oh,
And started
yeah.
creating those avenues, right?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you say that because I think we're actually in a very interesting time in business.
Yep.
And I want to keep this in the lane of networking and I want to keep this in the lane of like how to advance your career. And I think one of the biggest things that you bring up is this idea of connection. Like there's no better way to connect with someone than sharing or having shared experiences. Like with the second that someone knows, hey, oh, you went through sobriety too, me too, man. Like we're good. Like we're on a different level of connection now. Like there's a different level of trust. And I think at least the way I perceived business coming out of school or coming out of, getting into this world, it was very much you had to be buttoned up. You couldn't be authentic.
Yeah.
You can't share your faults. You can only share your successes. And the second I kind of flip that on itself, and the second I see other people flip that on itself, it's like the connection gets greater. You find the right opportunities. You find the right people that you want, in the desks with you every day as you're grinding it out because you feel this sense of community because you're operating from a place of authenticity. So if you think about networking and you think about finding opportunities, if you can be honest with yourself, you're going to know what you're looking for and you're going to attract those opportunities because you're going to connect with people that have gone through similar things as you. And I think there's this trend and this big switch in business right now where people are getting more vulnerable. Authenticity is celebrated. You're not just trying to be put into this box where it's like, this is the job and this is all you are known for. It's like, who is the person behind the job? And if you can really start sharing early and get comfortable early sharing who the person behind the job is, your career is going to go in a different direction. And now that version of yourself might not be aligned with your current scenario, and that's okay. Let's find the scenario that's right for you, that allows you to express yourself and operate from an authentic lens, because then you're going to perform at a higher level. You're going to have the right people in your corner. You're going to have those mentors, and then life is going to feel as though it's just happening with you, not to you.
It's interesting that you bring this point up, and it's funny because it can apply in all aspects of conversations when it not just in career professionals. I had this saying that at one point I tried to get into investing and day trading, and maybe that's a topic for a different episode. But everyone wants to celebrate their wins. Nobody wants to share their losses. And in sales, at during our times at Salesforce, we would always celebrate the wins during our like monthly or quarterly reviews. And something struck in me where it's like, you know how many more losses I have than wins? Why don't we share the losses? Because there are way more learning lessons in that than you saying, "Hey, I just closed this huge deal,"
Yeah, man.
or "I just got a scholarship here," or "I just closed this huge investment." And it's like, well, what about the things that you lost? Why don't you share about that? And that's
Yeah.
how you kind of like mental health is like you're sharing your loss with somebody like, "Hey, Billy, I'm struggling here." And you're like, "Oh, me too." Right. Like you said. And then you exit out and we become a tighter relationship. And now you're creating this network even more.
Yep.
How does that apply in your world?
Well, that resonated a lot actually, because, one of the things that I touched on earlier was like this idea of being outcome focused. And one of my favorite questions that I ask myself every day, right? Ultimately, I'm in sales, I'm in software sales, and my job is ultimately to deliver a number for the business.
Yep.
At the end of the day, that is why I'm paid. Now I have two options. I can focus on how am I going to get to that number? How am I going to get to that number? How am I going to get to that number? And ultimately, all I'm thinking about is the future. All I'm thinking about every day is how am I going to be a future version of myself? Now, what I figured out and like a little hack for me is the question I ask instead of how am I going to get to that number, The question I ask myself is, how does the person that achieves that number show up every single day?
Mm.
How does the person that blows their quota out, that gets to 150%, how does that person show up every day? What are the habits that they're living by? And instead of focusing on this result, I'm now process oriented. I've become a process junkie. So I don't even think about wins and losses anymore. I've kind of already in my head been like, I'm going to wherever I'm going to go based on how I show up right now, today. And I think this idea of like recalibrating this idea of winning and losing as like, yeah, I get it, right? We're all here to do a job, but
Yeah.
let's not obsess over the wins and losses. Let's obsess over, am I holding myself accountable to that version of myself that achieves the output in which I'm seeking? And if I can do that, results come, and they do every single time, whether
Yeah.
it be in strength training, whether it be in sports, whether it be in my relationship, whether it be at work, right? It's if you focus on what's in front of you right now and give everything you have in that moment, compounding commitment yields better results than anything else.
Yeah.
But if all I do is think about who I'm going to be, I'm not even doing anything now. I'm just thinking about what's coming. So there's like, I don't know if that's where you wanted to go with this, but
Yeah.
what resonated for me was like taking that mindset away from winning and losing, because that's binary. In reality, is this is a world of gray. And if you can get really clear on what's going to, yield success, and then just showing up, taking that one thing at a time down, the results will skyrocket.
So those are that's super helpful for everyone listening in on this. Not everyone's going to sit there and listen and say, "Well, Billy, you had this great mentorship. You had this great mentor. Your mom's best friend's brother
Yeah,
got you there, and yeah, you got a rut, but you were still at Salesforce, right? So you were able to have mentorship after that.
yeah,
You still were able to develop for yourself. So if we think about that process and mindset to apply it to N.O.P.E, what are some elements that you mentioned it before, but I want to hit home again on what you
yeah,
said. How do you apply that framework
yep.
to getting to yes with no?
Yeah, I think there's two analogies that I'll use here. The first one is it's the difference between, let's say you're playing a game of cards and you're dealt a hand. Am I going to try to play the hand that I'm dealt to the best of my ability? Or am I going to spend all my time and energy to try to go find better cards? And I think a lot of people in this life and who I interact with that are really high achievers are only focused on the hand that's in front of them. They're not worried about achieving and finding, hey, how do I go get the ace of spades? They're worried about, okay, I've got these 5 cards in my hand. How am I going to play them to the best of my ability? And then the next time, I'm probably going to get a better hand. And it's just focusing there. The other analogy is, let's imagine that you're sitting at a table, right? Are you focused on adding as much value to the table you're sitting at? Or are you more obsessed with the fact that you want to go to a bigger and better table? Typically, what happens is the people that add a ton of value to the table they're sitting at will be invited to the bigger and more important tables.
Yep.
So the way I perceive that question is it's simple, right? Like, how are you going to play the cards you're dealt? And I don't want to say that from like a place of, I mean, let's just call it for what it is. I was gifted a good hands of cards early on in life. Let's just call it what it is. Um, and honestly, I was still focused on trying to get better cards. And that get look
We
what that
all
look what look what that brought me. It brought me to the point where I hated who I was. I was drinking all the time. In my mind, I was a loser. What changed is I stopped worrying about the cards that I wanted and I started worrying about the cards that I had. The card was you have a drinking problem. The card was you're a BDR at Salesforce. The card was, whatever it is. What am I going to do with that? So I hear a lot out there of like, and this isn't meant to be a polarizing comment. This is just how I truly perceive it. It's like everyone's so obsessed with changing their deck. It's like, let's just focus on the hands that you have and let's play those to the best of our ability. and let's find the people that are going to allow me to get better cards, that are going to pull me to that next opportunity. And guess what? When you're operating from that place, do you think you're more attractive to be invited to the next table
Yep.
than the person that's just saying, "Hey, I want better cards." I went, "Well, why would I give you a better card? What have you done with the cards you have?"
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to go too deep into that, but it's just it's a slight mindset change. It's
Yep.
how do I give maximum value to the situation in front of me?
I love that. As you're sharing that, it reminded me of, it wasn't a TED talk, but Simon Sinek did this interview a couple years ago around, and he was talking around millennials. And he said that millennials want to get to the summit, but forget that they have to walk up the mountain. And
Yep.
they chase corners to try to get to the top, only to realize that they're going to fall halfway down. And that analogy stuck with me, and it was so real. And obviously, this comment's going to be around career profession.
Yeah.
Maybe it's around tech, but hopefully it applies to everyone else. And the way I looked at my mindset, and when I help some of my friends break into tech, it's don't think about your next promotion after your current role. Think around the skills you're going to build to get to the next 5 promotions from there. And
Yep.
think around the professionalism, the business acumen, everything you're going to learn from that moment. Because when that opportunity opens up and you are ready, you're just going to take off. And your analogy sounds a lot better. So,
No, man. I mean, I think you bring up a good point there in career progression, right? It's the same concept. Like, and I was a victim to this.
yep,
And candidly, I still am. It's only human to dream big and think in the future. It's can you recalibrate yourself quickly and effectively to get back to the moment so you can execute in the present so you're invited to bigger tables.
yep,
Like the reality is if you spend your whole career thinking about the next job, you're never going to succeed at the current job and you're never going to be invited to the next job.
absolutely.
So when I think about, I think this is like without a doubt the number one piece of advice I give people who are kind of looking to me as a mentor is instead of worrying about the title you're seeking or the perfect job for you right now, get really, really intentional around what's my toolkit look like right now? I'm
Yep,
an asset, right? At the end of the day, we are all assets to an organization. And what makes me unique outside of who I am as a person is what tools do I have to offer that organization? And if your focus early in your career and in general is to expand the skills that you have in your bag, you are going to be a more attractive asset in the future. So if
absolutely.
the only thing you think about as a professional is how do I acquire more skills readily and how do I give myself a plan to acquire those skills and show that I know how to use them quickly, you're going to move your career path. But if all you're thinking about is title, 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 time, you're going to be in for a long journey up to that mountain.
Yeah, and I also want to preference to the audience. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the career, right? Like you
Totally.
look at financial investing, you can look at sobriety. Like what are the steps, right? Like I want to be sober.
Oh
And
man,
and it's like, well, don't forget the steps that you currently have. And don't forget what you need to do. And don't forget the network that you have that's going to create those opportunities for you to be prepared. Right. And I think it's so important that you're mentioning this of I even myself, I always want financial literacy. I want to that financial freedom and I want to get to the next level. But I try to let it happen organically. And when things fall on my lap and you're ready for those moments rather than trying to force it, right? And I think that's where when you're asking the right questions to your network, maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's someone you're having
yep.
coffee with, maybe it's someone you're playing basketball with. You just start asking the right questions rather than asking for handouts, you will flourish. And I just kind of want to leave it at that, but maybe if you wanted to add something else to that as well too.
Yeah, I it's it's funny. Like I let's use another analogy. I'm always full of analogies, right?
I'm
Like
a storyteller. We always use
when
an.
when I think about a career or any goal I set in general, right? Let's think about a bowling lane. If you roll a bowling ball, the ultimate strategy and goal is to knock down all the pins.
Yeah.
Now, along the way, there might be things that take that bowling ball into the gutter. right? You get off the plan. When I think about getting a mentor, I want to find people that are willing to be my bumpers. Are my mentors willing to push me back down the right path? Are they going to hold me accountable? Because I don't want someone that's just going to say, "You're doing great, you're awesome." I want someone to be like, "Dude, like you told me you were going to do this last time we had a call, and you haven't. If anything, you've taken step backs. Like, let's get back on track." The other thing is, I always want to hold myself accountable to being my own bumper.
Yeah.
So when I think about kind of goal setting, you mentioned this, right? Sobriety, career, whatever it is, it's one day at a time. Right? Like I've been sober for 4 years, but if I started thinking about five, I'd go crazy. All I have to do is if I don't drink the first beer, I can't get drunk. If I do the one rep in the weight room, I'm going to get stronger over time. And it's this idea of compounding commitment being the greatest asset that you have. So as long as you have a plan and you have someone that's going to help you and steer you and develop that plan with you and a mentor and hold you accountable to that plan, and you're willing to show up every day and commit to that plan, doesn't matter if you win, lose, fail, see results or not. Math is in your favor. It will go like this over time.
Yep.
But the number one thing that you can control is the commitment to yourself of, do I have intentionality in my life? Am I willing to, put the plan together? And instead of living life on highs and lows, it's like, it's not about what I'm experiencing. It's about doing it and being disciplined to that and trusting that the outcome in which you visualized will come as you show up every day and crush that.
Awesome. So when it comes to just going back to sobriety, right? When it goes back to those conversations, are these the same conversations that you and I are sharing with people who are currently struggling with those challenges in front of them? Like, what
Yeah.
would you share with some of the listeners? They probably are thinking, I don't have a drinking problem, and
Yeah.
it's Wednesday and they just cracked open their first White
Yeah.
Claw or
Yeah.
their first whiskey drink. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the conversations you want to share with them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to fall back on the man in the mirror. Um, you know, ultimately, I'm never sitting there judging someone. Like my intent in life and just who I am as a human is like, how can I show up for others to help them become the best version of themselves? I'm not here to tell them what their path is. I'm not here to like put judgment on them and say, hey, you have a drinking problem, you're not eating the right, whatever, right? What I try to do as a person is show up and support the individual in whom they want to be. Now, are you willing to do that with yourself? And that's why I look at the man in the mirror, right? Like if you're trying to justify to me that you don't have a drinking problem, why are you even having that thought in the first place? Where's that stemming from? Are you questioning that? I don't know. I don't need to know. But what I always say is specifically around drinking, and I don't know if this is the right way to go about it, but the way I've always thought about it is like I think it's really, really important to be comfortable with the idea that you might. And if you don't now, you might later. And that's okay. It's not about if you do or don't. It's just about being honest with yourself and how you feel right then.
Yeah.
And just being okay with the idea that, you know, you might or you might not, but it's not about that. It's about what do you need to be that best version of yourself. And if you think pulling drinking out is that, perfect. If you don't, awesome. Let's moderate it. Let's not. But are you looking in the mirror and really assessing and being honest with yourself? And then are you willing to like try to fix things yourself, or B, have the humility and ask other people for help?
So a lot of times complacency and just laziness comes in, right? You're I know the answer to this, but I want you to
Yeah,
share.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So complacency is probably one of the biggest procrastinations for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
I get complacent a lot, right? And sometimes I do the man in the mirror check. What are some other tips and advice and things they can do to get themselves back on track, right? Where you
Yeah.
can look yourself in the mirror, but how many people say, okay, cool, Billy, I look myself in the mirror, and then I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. No,
yeah.
it's a great point. I think the first thing, like, I, I think the clarity and what the standard of yourself is so important. Like, have you taken the time to write down on a piece of paper, like, this is the standard of the individual in which I want to be? And then do you have the humility and are you humble enough to address, like, I'm not aligning to that version of myself? And in other words, like, do I have a vision? Can I think about the ideal version of myself and the life that I want to live and the father that I want to be or the partner that I want to be or the coworker? Like, do you have that defined? Because if we don't know what we're striving to be, there's no adjustments to be made. It's just you're kind of living and wandering life aimlessly. So the first thing is, if you don't know what looking in the mirror looks like, or you don't really know what your baseline is, like, take some time to find clarity and, like, who's that version of yourself that you want to be and how you want to live. And then you have a baseline to really work off of. As it result, you're thinking about, am I on track or not?
This may get personal on myself, but when it comes to just like mental health and just getting better,
Yeah.
me personally, I love reaching out to others because one, I love exposing myself and creating vulnerability for myself because the reward of that is accountability and your
Yeah.
friends are aware of your situations. And you don't have to go into too much detail of like, hey, I'm struggling here, or I'm in a bad relationship, or work is not going well. But if you can open it up a little bit, you may come across someone within your network that is struggling with the same thing. And it's like, hey, let's hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah.
And I reached out to a friend who was on one of my previous podcasts. He was in the military. And we both just started talking about mental health. And we both started seeing therapists and just, I think COVID also gave a lot of mental health because everyone's stuck at home,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Totally.
So the more you start talking about it, the more you start creating this awareness. And it's like, hey, Billy, then you start texting each other accountability things of like, hey, I did this today, I did this week. And
100%.
then that is another step. And that even goes into if it's career, if it's career transition, if it's financial literacy, mental health, or maybe just physical health. You having that network and talking to those people and saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. These are the steps I'm doing. What should I be doing to continue to create more opportunities for myself?
Yeah.
Rather than you saying, Billy, can you give me $1,000 so I can do this and that? And it's like, let me pause you right there. I'm not going to do that. So that's kind of how I
Yeah.
create Nope. Um,
This is bringing me to an interesting thought in what you're saying here, right? It's like, it's this idea. How do I say this? It, there's this like, there's this attractiveness to authenticity in that way. Like, I think about if I were going to mentor someone and try to help someone get into a career path. If someone showed up and was like, hey, this is where I'm at, this is where I'm struggling, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. Like, this is now, and if I connect with that person, right? We talked about the importance of connect. Like, me helping that individual get a job is like a win for me, selfishly too.
yeah,
Like, I'm gonna get energized by that. Like, if you find the right mentor, your wins are their wins. And the only way to understand how to help someone win is if you're authentic about what you're trying to accomplish or where you're struggling.
yeah,
Like, there's nothing, I always say this, there's nothing that fires me up more when I feel like I've helped someone take a different level, like level up in their life. Like, that almost feels better than when I personally level up in life. And that doesn't mean that everyone's like that, but like, there's something to be said for like not losing sight of the fact that, like, your win can be your mentor's win. If not, it feels like more of a win for your mentor than you at sometimes.
yeah,
And the only way to get there is being authentic on where you need help.
yeah. I love that because I've helped so many of my friends. Now, this is just kind of pigeonholing myself to the conversation of
Yeah,
career
yeah,
tech. I've helped so many of my friends create this new framework of thinking what my current reality is. I'm stuck, and how do I break out of it? I've helped my friends who were maintenance workers. I've helped friends who were bartenders break into tech and just create this new narrative like, hey, what you're currently doing, I'm going to help you get out of it. But I'm going to give you the level of effort that you're going to give me back. And I've had friends who wasted my time
yep.
and it just like, hey, this was a loss and I'm going to chalk it up as that and find another network because I gave you the resources and you kind of just took it and threw it out the window. So,
Yeah, it's you. There's another thought I had here that I think that's super important though, like, for real. Um, I find a lot of people love to get comfortable in finding the reasons for why they won't get the job. Oh, I'm coming out of this position that has nothing to do with the position I'm
Yep.
trying to get. Like, I'm not going to get it for this reason. I'm not going to. It's like, let's refocus that energy. Like, why are you going to get it? Like, you are an asset that's acquired a ton of experience in what you've done. You are a professional
Yeah.
and you've learned a ton along the way. It doesn't matter what your job title is. What are the skills you've learned? Well, you know what? Let's use the example as a janitor. That you're a janitor in a school or in an office. I can imagine like talking to the person that's in the building that's got this job that you want is really hard sometimes. That's almost like a cold call. I would
Yeah.
tap random people on the shoulder and I would ask them a ton of questions. And I created really like that's sales. You're selling yourself. You're creating a brand for yourself. I've seen so many people at Salesforce, right? One of my favorite stories at Salesforce is there was a guy who worked security, and every morning you'd walk in, right? That guy was on a mission to let everyone know who he was. And because he showed up from the lens of being a good, awesome, humble person that wanted to brighten everyone's day, he now has a great job at Salesforce. He worked into the corporation that way.
Yep.
And it's because he never devalued himself.
Yep.
He was never finding reasons for why he wasn't qualified. All he did all day long was network with people and try to find reasons for why he was qualified for the next thing. And
I
I
need
think
to
that is
bring him on the
such an
next
important thing.
podcast. Well,
Yeah, you do.
yeah. So for some of you who may be listening from Salesforce, shout out to our buddy Mike.
Yeah.
He was a former security guard, and that guy was a master networker.
Yep.
And I think it's the same thing as well too. Just going back to my friends, of how are you going to tell your story that resonates with that opportunity? And
Yes.
right, like my friends that were janitors, it's like, no, I've never done sales. Like, well, technically you did. Like, you have to sell
Yes.
yourself. You've done vendor management. You oversaw money. Like, if you didn't do your job, how much would that organization lose out if you just didn't show up? Right? You oversaw X amount of dollars. And I think it's great. And before we jumped on this podcast, when we were first connecting around the idea of you coming on, you said something around your mentorship, and you said it in the very beginning, and we're coming up towards the end, and I'd love for you to say it again. It was around attach yourself to mentors that you align with,
Yeah.
and that will create the door for no.
Yep. Yeah.
If you want to kind of share it
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. 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 I think, yeah, I mean, just to recap what you said, like attach yourself to the right mentor. And the only way you're going to find the right mentor is if you show up authentically and you're real and you're vulnerable and you say, I have no idea what this career path looks like. I need help. This is who I am. And usually that mentor is going to love the fact that you're being real, right? Human beings are attracted to that. And then they're going to find there's going to be a moment, like I'll give you the example of mine, and maybe this will be helpful. The reason I got the mentor that I did outside of it being, a friend of a family is I shared that I'm really struggling with the fact that I thought I'd want to be in finance and I hate it and I don't want to be and I'm looking for something else. He
Yeah.
immediately identified with that and said, "You sound exactly like me when I was in college. This is what I did." And now we have that common ground that we never would have had if I wasn't willing to be vulnerable in that moment.
Yeah.
So when I think about connecting with mentors or trying to find mentors, it's trying to find people that have similar experiences to me. And the only way to find that is if I'm willing to be courageous enough to share my experiences and get authentic. And the last layer to that is instead of attaching to the result that I want to make someone my mentor, it's attaching to the idea that if I show up to every conversation authentically, vulnerably, and truly aligned to who I am and who I want to be, the right mentor is going to fall in my lap if I have enough conversations. And I think that's the key. It's changing how you operate when you enter that conversation.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're coming up on time here,
Yeah.
and I'm sure the audience wants to know, how do I get a hold of you, and how do
Yeah.
I create opportunities? So, one, how do they find you on LinkedIn? And
Yep.
two, what are some social media handles that they can get a hold of you, and just kind of follow your story from there.
Yeah. So Billy Murphy on LinkedIn. I work for Alert Media. And then my Instagram handle is Bill Vute Murphy. Those are probably the best two avenues. I'll say this. I love connecting around the personal stuff. Um, like the career stuff's great, but if I can be of any help in terms of making you feel like you've taken one step further to kind of fulfillment or alignment to who you are or leveling up, and one conversation could be the difference between you taking that next step or not. I mean, that's all you got to do to sell me to jump on the phone with you. So, um, reach out. I love this stuff. I love these conversations. Hopefully, I'm not trying to be too preachy in what I said. I'm just trying to share authentically in my experience. And if you identified with anything that I shared today, like please do not hesitate to reach out. This is the stuff I love, and candidly, it's what I live for. And I wouldn't be here today if other people weren't willing to answer a similar call. Um, and I believe in giving that back. So I'm here to support and help, and I really appreciate you having me on this, David.
Yeah.
It's good to reconnect, and hopefully, hopefully this is received well by some people and makes an impact.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the time this is released, you will no longer be a fiance. You'll be married. So I
Yes,
want to
yes.
congratulate you to that.
Thank you.
And for the audience, I worked with both of them, and it was amazing to watch their journey. And um, it's been amazing to watch your journey. Just you go through your obstacles and to where you're at now. And I think it's amazing. And if anyone is listening here, right, and you have any questions for Billy, obviously, please do not hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions for me, I will drop my information below. And if you want to be a guest on this podcast, please do not hesitate to reach out. Please like, subscribe, and follow. And we will continue on this getting to yes with N.O.P.E journey. And I'm your host, David Floor. Again, we have Billy Murphy. Thank you, episode 3. And until next time, take care.